Hello, I'm Matthew Hulbert, and I live over in the Meadows 247. I'm a person who came of age in the 1960s, and probably lots of you know that that era was famous for three things: drugs and sex and rock and roll. And when I look back at my life, I found out that I noticed there were three things that kept popping up. They were drugs and submarines, and Korea. Maybe you'll hear that as I talk about it. I don't plan to tell you any lies. I do plan to leave out some of the things I'm less proud of. When I was a teenager and a young man, I suffered from something that is pretty common, and some feminists call testosterone poisoning. It causes young men to do stupid things, and I did a few. But I thought it was important to tell you a little about my life as a child, both in the home and in the community, because I think those experiences have a lot to do with how you grow up. I was born in West Virginia, very rural area. I checked on Google for this talk, and I found there were about 8 houses and trailers altogether in that area. And my father was a prison guard. He was transferred to another prison when I was fairly young, so the first house I really remember was in Rockbridge County, and I was there all the way through my young years, and in fact went to college there, so I was only out of the county for a couple years. This was a great place for a kid to grow up. It was an area that had been really farmed out and the land rather destroyed, all red clayed and gullied by 100 years before. About the time of the Civil War, when a lot of boys from that area got the chance to see other parts of the country, and they got out of there and didn't come back, so the population didn't grow particularly. And the trees did grow back up, and it was a rather pretty area, and it even attracted a certain amount of tourists, but for the people that lived there, it was a poor area. My school had electricity. It had outhouses, but it did have electricity. And at the time, a lot of the white schools in the county didn't even have electricity, so they had kerosene lamps. And I can't tell you what the black schools were like. This was a time when there was a lot of difficulty, because this was the time when Virginia was practicing massive resistance to avoid desegregation of the schools. And it was a time of some tensions. And I was very much aware of those, because after all, I'd been born in West Virginia, and so I took a lot of teasing as being a Yankee. This was also a little bit of a challenge in the family. My family was very dedicated to being sure that children could get a chance to get a higher education, which my parents had missed out on, and also very active in their church life. They practiced a kind of Christianity that's a little heavy and dark. There was a lot of awareness of guilt and sin and of personal duty. But there also was a sense that God loved everybody, and this meant you had to treat people lovingly. And this was a problem, because my father refused to just call the black people that he knew by their first name or boy, but insisted on calling them Mrs. So-and-so, Miss So-and-so, Mr. So-and-so. And this was created sometimes some ugliness from other other people around. I suppose that probably had something to do with me a few years later deciding that I'd go on one of the freedom rides down through the South and down into Texas. I said my parents were really big on education. I can remember when I was in grade school that one day my father came home with a big stack of books. After the end of school, he'd ask the principal, could I borrow some books from the school library so my kids would have books at home? We lived there in that area, excuse me, until during my junior year in high school, my junior and senior years, we lived in the city of Lynchburg. Despite the massive resistance activities that were going on, the schools, I beg your pardon, the schools I went to were never closed down, but just a few miles down the road, the county schools were all closed in 1959, and there were so-called Christian academies with state funding set up for white kids, but there were no schools for black children from 1959 until the schools reopened in 1965. And I should say, we celebrated Confederate Memorial Day at football games. We didn't sing Dixie. I mean, we did sing Dixie. We didn't sing the Star Spangled Banner. When I went to Lynchburg, the girl who was on the bench ahead of me in chemistry, I didn't know her name, but I found out later she had decided, and I quote, I'm going to get Matt to ask me to marry him. And after I won scholarship and went off to college back in Rockbridge County, studied chemistry, and after that, we indeed were married and promptly moved off to Madison, Wisconsin, where I went to grad school, and she supported me. After a few years, we had a daughter, Tempe, and Tempe moved to Ann Arbor to go to school, and that's why we came here. I went on, took some part-year faculty jobs, and also to support my growing family, a son, David, who now lives in St. Louis. I started an analytical service that analyzed materials that were used in manufacturing drugs and supported the analytical work for metabolic studies in clinical trials, cancer clinical trials. This business grew well, but despite my good quality work, the business went bust because I didn't have the adequate business sense to keep it going and didn't select my customers very well. During the faculty positions, I was asked to consult with Bethlehem Steel, who were interested in digging up manganese nodules off the seafloor because this was something big. Mining ship was being built for that, and they needed manganese to make the specialty steels. Of course, we now know that this was about submarines. The goal was really not to mine, but to pull up a Russian submarine which had sunk deep in the Pacific and get its secrets. This time, I also got a couple of postdocs. One of them, I was the chief scientist on a small ship, and it turned out that sister ship was the sister ship to the Pueblo, which was notable because it was captured by the North Koreans, and for a long time the crew was held hostage. I also, in a separate postdoc at NOAA, was asked to look at the hard submarine sediment, the floor of the ocean in that area, and determine its electrical conductivity. I was able to do that. It was a lot of fun. And it turned out that that was work that was very interesting to the Navy, and they'd had the Corps of Engineers attempting to do it for a couple of years, but that work had failed. And the reason for the interest was that this was very important in the games of hide and seek with submarines to understand this property. After this, I joined a great big mining company. They had the biggest phosphate mines in the world. They had the biggest potash mines in the world. While I was there, they commissioned the biggest power shovel in the world, the Ace of Spades. And they were doing big things, and they knew that just as a chef has got to break a lot of eggs to make an omelet, they knew that they couldn't be bound by the petty rules of that people had to follow when they were doing smaller things. And so they didn't carefully follow rules in lots of areas, such as accounting and reporting their finances. And they didn't follow a lot of personnel rules, which led to me having the opportunity to do all kinds of different jobs. And I loved it because I liked doing work that applied science, where I had to learn new science and technology and then solve real problems. So that led me to being sent out in the desert of Utah and Wyoming with a gunny sock and a hammer and sampling rocks with the representative of the company that wanted to lease this land to us. And sure enough, the rocks were pretty good clinotillite, and the company leased thousands and thousands of acres of land, put up a plant to beneficiate the rock, and kind of a cheapo job, and then said, okay, Matt, your job is to find something that can be done with this rock. We don't know, we don't care what. The only rule is you've got to have customers that'll buy it in a unit train quantity. Now, a unit train is 100 big railroad cars, and that's how much you got to sell. So I got to do loads of different things: plastic fillers, water treatment, radioactive waste mitigation, kitty litter. And luckily for me, although we got some pretty good sales with kitty litter, luckily, because it would take up ammonia, which is the problem with cat. But fortunately for me, we got a big snow in Wyoming, collapsed the roof of the production facility, destroyed the equipment, and I was moved on to another project. And this happened, this was a project developing drugs, cutting-edge work. The reason that happened was the company had been selling stuff which they sold for between $100 and $300 a ton. And a few weeks before I joined the company, they'd talked to the people at the R&D center where I was working, and they said, well, okay, what other products have you got? They'd recently bought them out. And they said, well, we do have this one little drug. And they said, oh, how much does that sell for a ton? And I checked the arithmetic for this talk, and it's $40 million a ton. And their reaction was, $40 million? And they decided to go into drugs, and they decided not to go in. I said they were a big buccaneering crowd. They said, all right, we're going to go into recombinant genetic technology. We're going to start at the bleeding edge of the technology. So I got to work on processes for recovering the drug from the fermentation, for growing up the critters that made the drug, and was responsible for all of the work to develop the manufacturing processes, and also finally, when I helped to write the regulatory documentation for the FDA, and then when we started to build a brand new plant, I was made a senior project engineer. The real engineers weren't real thrilled about that, but I was able to do some of the design work, particularly concerned with how materials and people moved in and out, because this had to be done in a sterile environment, and just to get people gowned up, masks, the whole business, much more than we see in COVID, and then get undressed so they could take a break and get back in again, and get materials cleaned up so that they can go through appropriate airlocks and come into the sterile area or out. This is complicated work and very interesting. At the same as that progressed, I also was given a second assignment. What happened was, the company, being a buccaneering crowd, was not doing too well with the FDA. The FDA doesn't like people to not follow the rules. And so the commissioner of the FDA said one day, I think it would be a good thing if some of you people in the pharmaceutical industry would send some of your people, you've got all these scientists, send some of them to work in the federal labs. So I was sent regularly on short-term assignments to work with the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory, and I got to do lots of cool things there. I got to help design and then do the factory testing of and help design the facility for the first electron microscope in the U.S., TEM, that could do high-resolution imaging, very high-resolution imaging of wet samples. This is a real breakthrough because normally this operates under high vacuum and you can't have water in high vacuum. And I also got to work on more hide and seek for submarines, some of that area. When there was a Soviet submarine that was sunk up in the Arctic Ocean, and I did the first proposal of how to safely get into, find out just how big the problem is, and also worked on how you might mitigate it, because this sub was sunk complete with a liquid metal cooled nuclear reactor. And of course, the Alaskan waters that feed our salmon industry, which we have delicious salmon at Glacier Hills, but we didn't want a lot of radioactive materials in the salmon. And so we had to look through that and how to do that. Well, our buccaneering management, finally, I got a chance to leave the company when the CEO went to jail. They didn't get him for anything that went on at the company. Like Al Capone, they got him for tax evasion, but sent him to jail just the same. And I joined, at that time, I signed up with a small company that didn't have any products, but did have enough money to pay the people and pay the rent for 8 more months. But it was in the Philadelphia area. So this was very, I knew there would be other jobs. But indeed, we did get a product. And I found this turned out also, because it was a small company, I got to do things in all kinds of different areas. I think when I look back at it, I covered every single area except marketing and clinical, and I'd done clinical before. So in my career, I did everything but marketing. And my major role was taking the things that came out of R&D, or helping them come out of R&D, and into scaling them up, getting manufacturing so we could have commercial scale, doing the troubleshooting, finding people to do the manufacture, finding the key products that you had to have in to support the manufacture, and then support the distribution of the materials. And this was especially exciting because I actually knew people whose lives were dramatically changed by the drugs that we made. One of our neighbors from one of my postdocs down in Florida was a person who had finally, because of narcolepsy, been unable to work. She had young children. She wasn't really able to take care of her kids. And within 2 weeks of our first medication, which was for narcolepsy, she started to recover, and within a few months after that, she was back at work. And this was great. And we made some very good cancer drugs as well. While I was there, one of the things that I was asked to do was to join a five-person team, who had the responsibility for looking at young, very early companies that, for the most part, didn't have any products approved, but had things going on that could lead to either approved products or platforms for making other products. And so the five of us would really look into the companies. It was the strategic intent of my company to spend as much on R&D as the leaders did, and to spend an equal amount on buying in other new young companies that had been doing research so we could have new drugs. If we bought a company, then it was my responsibility to integrate it into our company, and particularly into the whole manufacturing area. So my responsibilities in the due diligence team were to look at the quality issues, manufacturing issues, and as usually the case, we didn't have a regulatory person on the team to determine the regulatory pathway and any challenges that would present. We invested $1.9 billion in these companies, and plus promised for milestones if things went right, another $1.7 billion. And I have to say that probably my biggest contributions were looking at the things that would make them not successful. So the companies that I identified that we couldn't go ahead with, typically because they hadn't done all they needed to do and they weren't as far along as they thought, and therefore the time and money to get them to commercialization would be substantially longer. I learned a lot about the things that can go wrong. About 10 years ago, while I was there, one day I got a fax, and the fax was one sheet of paper. At the top it had some writing in what I recognized as Korean, and in the center of the page was a map of the Korean peninsula, north and south, with little X marks all around the peninsula. And so I said, oh, I can guess what this is. And I was waiting for a phone call. Days go by, I didn't get a phone call. So I called up the Naval Research Lab and I said, hey, I got a fax. It didn't say who it was from, but you know, I think you sent it. He said, oh yeah, look, it'll be a while longer. The captain that's responsible for the program wasn't done. His ship has been captured by the North Koreans. This was, I think, 2010. And they're being held, and nothing will happen until we get him out. And we're negotiating. And so, sure enough, later on I got a call, and they said, yeah, well, we'd like you to come on down and work on a project. And I was really nervous because a number of years before I'd been called in for a project, and the project I was responsible for co-leading a workshop on how do you deal with anti-ship mines. And during the workshop, it was clear that the mines we were worried about were in the Persian Gulf, and we were worried about how you could go in, because there was a fellow named Saddam Hussein, and the last time there'd been trouble with him, the Navy had intended to go in and land on the beaches of Kuwait. But the first ship to go in, I don't think it was highly published, hit a mine, and that plan was put off. And you'll remember it was a long time after we said that this was unacceptable before we finally went in over the desert. Well, I was worried because I thought this might presage something bad, because when I did the previous project, it was several months before 9/11, before the run-up to the second Gulf War. It turned out this was just the proper, looking at potential threats, figuring out how to deal with them, but it was very worrisome. Well, the company that I worked with was very successful, and we got bought out by a bigger crowd. Big Shark came on, and that gave me the opportunity to do what I do now. I consult half-time, helping companies get their internal systems in place, get funding, or doing independent audits of their suppliers to see that they follow the regulations and quality rules and so on. And the other half-time, I'm a volunteer. I volunteer over at the university's School of Business, helping students in the life science area to figure out how they can get money from venture capitalists. Interesting job, interesting volunteer work. I continue to volunteer with health related not-for-profits here with Packard Health. You may be familiar with it. They run 3 clinics treating anybody whether or not they can pay. I know a couple people in the Meadows who use the family clinic there, and they also treat essentially all of the homeless population in Washtenaw County, which is not as small as I'd expect, and also people who don't have insurance. There I do entries into medical records until COVID came along, and we're too crowded over there. People packed into a room, and they said, you can't come anymore, we can't have social distancing. The other thing I do is I work with the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative. I've worked with them for about the last 8 years. They were the group founded by Doctors Without Borders to discover, develop, and make available the medicines that are needed in third world countries where people don't have enough money to attract pharmaceutical companies to invest all the money into making the drugs. I'm really proud of 2 things that we've got out recently. One, for sleeping sickness, the disease carried by that tsetse fly, parasitic, gets in the brain, 100% death rate. And this potentially impacts about 7 million people in the central part of Africa, in the Congo. DNDi put in the teams and trained people, local people, so that they could run the clinical studies, brought out a first medication which required a box about this big, had to be treated in a clinic, had to be carried in areas that really don't have roads by boat, motorcycle, hand carried, and you had to do a lumbar puncture to see if the right stage of the disease where it could treat it. It was a lot better than the previous treatment, which killed 1 in 20 of the people that were treated and was incredibly painful because it was impossible to actually get the dose that would get all the parasites in the brain and not kill the patient. So this one was a lot better, but now, about a year ago, came out with a treatment that works, no lumbar puncture, treats all stages of the disease, 100% cure, 10 pills, 10 days, 2 pills, I think, a day, less than $1 a day for the cost of it, delivered. And the second one is just in January, they put out a product that treats HIV/AIDS in babies and toddlers. This has been the single largest killer of children under 5 in 5 African countries. Now, this sprinkle, which is multiple antiretrovirals, which of course, for a disease that doesn't exist really elsewhere in the world, because we treat mothers first before they give birth. But it's stable, stands up to tropical weather, stable sprinkle. The mothers sprinkle it into the baby's milk or food for toddlers. And it too, although it's usually paid for governments, costs less than $1 a day. And I'm really proud of that accomplishment. I'm proud of Doctors Without Borders, of DNDi, and I'm proud that I could be part of it. And I'm delighted to be here in Glacier Hills. Thank you all.